A geneticist at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig sits alone with a screen full of genetic matches, data pulled from a cave buried in the Altai mountains of southern Siberia, rows of numbers, allele by allele, until two of them line up in a way no one expected. These aren't just two more Neanderthal samples in a growing database. They're father and daughter. For over a decade, researchers had been sequencing Neanderthal genomes one at a time, scattered across continents and tens of thousands of years. And in all that time, nobody had ever proven a direct family relationship between two individuals. Not a probable connection, a confirmed one. The site has a name, Chagyrskaya Cave, a hunting camp perched on a riverside outcrop in southern Siberia, chosen by Neanderthals for the game that passed through the valley below. From that single location, researchers pulled 17 individuals worth of Neanderthal remains and sequenced them, the largest batch of Neanderthal DNA ever recovered in one study. Somewhere in that pile of genetic material was a teenage girl, still living alongside her father, still part of the group she was born into. And immediately, a second question follows the first. If her father is here, and her extended family is here, where is her mother? What if the last piece of Neanderthal history wasn't a bone, or a stone tool, but a family tree? If ancient genomes are your thing, stick around and hit subscribe. This channel digs into the DNA stories nobody else is covering. That question of the missing mother sits at the center of everything that follows in this story, because the answer, if it exists, is still buried in a cave that researchers have barely begun to excavate. What Chagyrskaya gave paleogenetics wasn't a single skeleton to interpret in isolation. It was 17 individuals from the same place, hinting at relationships, at structure, at something that looked, for the first time, like an actual functioning community rather than a scattering of isolated bones separated by millennia. The implications of that shift would take the rest of this story to unpack, starting with just how differently scientists had been picturing Neanderthal life before this cave gave up its secrets. For most of the public imagination, and even for a lot of the scientific record, Neanderthals existed as isolated fossils. A skull here, a femur there, each one studied on its own, disconnected from any social context. The conclusions drawn from that kind of evidence tended to stay broad and population level. Statements like modern humans carrying roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA, the product of interbreeding somewhere in deep prehistory. Useful, but distant. Nothing that told you what a Neanderthal's daily life or family life actually looked like. Krishna Virama, a population geneticist at Stony Brook University, put it plainly when discussing this field. Understanding kinship and social structure was genuinely new territory for ancient genome studies. Not a refinement of existing work, a category of question researchers simply hadn't been equipped to answer before, and that gap had persisted for a long time. The first Neanderthal draft genome came out in 2010. A full decade of sequencing followed, genome after genome, site after site. And in all of that work, not one confirmed family unit had been identified, not a parent and child, not siblings. The tools existed to compare Neanderthals to denisovans, to modern humans, to each other across vast stretches of time, but not yet to say, with confidence, that two specific individuals were related within a single generation. The assumption that filled that gap was almost inevitable. Neanderthals as scattered, solitary bands, moving through the landscape in small, isolated pockets, leaving behind fragments too disconnected to reconstruct any real social structure. It was a reasonable assumption, given the evidence available. It was also about to be proven incomplete. Because what the researchers were sitting on wasn't just another isolated genome. It was an entire community, waiting to be reconstructed. Parents, cousins, an aunt, all recoverable from cave sediment and bone fragments that had sat in the ground for 54,000 years. The 2022 Nature paper broke that decade-long silence with 13 genomes pulled from one place, one time. That paper carried a name and a set of numbers that would reshape how this entire field talked about Neanderthal life. Skov and colleagues, publishing in Nature, volume 610, pages 519 through 525, delivered the field's lead finding: a genetically confirmed nuclear family living inside a single Neanderthal community. Of the 17 individuals sequenced, 13 yielded usable genome-wide data, 11 pulled from Chagyrskaya itself, 2 more from the nearby Okladnikov cave. Within that data, the core relationships took shape. A father and his teenage daughter, confirmed genetically rather than assumed. A young male, likely a nephew or a cousin. An adult female identified as a second-degree relative, possibly an aunt, possibly a grandmother, and separate from all of them, among the remaining sequenced individuals, a second pair of possible cousins turned up, unconnected to the first family line. Two distinct family lines, occupying the same cave. Benjamin Peter, the study's senior author, offered the line that captured what the paper actually accomplished. It gives, in his words, a concrete picture of what a Neanderthal community may have looked like, not a guess built from scattered fossils. A picture built from genetics. The timing mattered too. Independent dating methods placed the occupation at roughly 54,000 years ago. Luminescence dating from Jacobs and colleagues in 2019. Radiocarbon dating from Duca and colleagues that same year. Two separate techniques landing on the same window. And yet, for all that this was the largest Neanderthal genetic dataset ever assembled, the researchers themselves estimated they'd analyzed less than a quarter of the remains already recovered from the cave. This family, as complete as it seemed, was a fragment of a much bigger picture still sitting underground. Move into the cave itself, and the picture gets more specific than any Neanderthal site studied before. Chagyrskaya Cave sits in the foothills of the Altai Mountains, a rocky outcrop positioned to overlook the river valleys below, valleys that funneled migrating game directly past the entrance. It's not hard to see why a Neanderthal group would choose this spot and stay. For 14 years, researchers from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography at the Russian Academy of Sciences have worked this site layer by layer. What they've pulled out is staggering in scale. Hundreds of thousands of stone tools, countless animal bones, and more than 80 individual Neanderthal bone and tooth fragments, one of the largest Neanderthal fossil assemblages found anywhere in the world, not just in the region. The animals hunted here tell their own story. Ibex, horses, bison, all moving through the valley on seasonal routes the Neanderthals clearly understood and exploited. But it's the stone tools that carry an unexpected clue. The raw material used to make them wasn't local. It was carried in from dozens of kilometers away. And that same raw material shows up not just at Chagyrskaya, but at nearby Okladnikov Cave as well. Long before any DNA evidence existed, this overlap in tool-making material was already hinting that these two sites, these two communities, were connected. Even after 14 years of excavation, only about a third of the cave has been dug through. Two-thirds of whatever remains buried at Chagyrskaya is still there, untouched, waiting. A father and daughter were about to become the clearest proof yet of that connection. At the center of everything this study found sits one confirmed relationship: an adult male and a teenage female, matched genetically as father and daughter. Not inferred from age or position in the cave, confirmed, directly, in the DNA itself. Her presence there, still living alongside her father as an adolescent, tells researchers something specific about the stage of life she was in. She hadn't yet left to join another group. Whatever social system governed Neanderthal communities, it hadn't yet pulled her away from her birth family, not at this age, not at this point in her life. From that single pairing, a broader pattern starts to emerge. Daughters, it seems, stayed with their birth family through childhood and adolescence, only leaving once they reached an age to find a mate elsewhere. Sons followed a different path entirely. The young male identified nearby, likely a cousin or nephew to the father and daughter, represents the other half of that pattern. Males who stayed, permanently, in the community they were born into. Lorit Skov, one of the researchers behind the study, has been direct about what he hopes comes next. That future work can build more complete Neanderthal family trees, and specifically, that it might locate this teenage girl's missing mother somewhere in the unexcavated portion of the cave. What this single confirmed relationship represents is a first for the field. Paleoanthropology now has its first confirmed adolescent-to-parent Neanderthal relationship established through ancient DNA, rather than pieced together from skeletal guesswork and inference. Her father and her cousin weren't the only kin sharing that cave. Beyond the father and daughter, the genetic picture widens. An adult female turned up as a second-degree relative to the pair, likely an aunt, possibly a grandmother, sharing the same living space. The young male mentioned earlier, probably a nephew or cousin, rounds out this immediate cluster around the father and daughter, forming something that looks, structurally, like an actual extended family, rather than a loose grouping of unrelated individuals. But the kinship in this cave didn't stop at one family. Among the remaining sequenced individuals, a second pair of possible cousins emerged, genetically connected to each other, but not to the father, the daughter, the aunt, or the young male nearby. That points to a second, distinct clan sharing the same physical space, whether at the same time or across overlapping periods of occupation. This is, on its own, a meaningful technical achievement. The genetic resolution required to detect a relationship as specific as second-degree relative, distinguishing an aunt from a stranger, a grandmother from an unrelated adult, had never been achieved for Neanderthals before this study made it possible. Lara Cassidy, commenting on the research, captured what makes this find stand apart from prior Neanderthal genetic work. The remarkable part isn't only the kinship itself, it's that these individuals cluster together at one specific point in time and space, rather than being scattered across the tens of thousands of years that make up the broader span of Neanderthal existence. Most of what genetics had revealed about Neanderthals up to this point came from comparing individuals separated by vast stretches of time. This was different. This was a snapshot. Figuring out who moved and who stayed meant looking at two completely different kinds of DNA. The mechanism behind these conclusions comes down to two distinct types of genetic material, each inherited along a different line. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child, generation after generation. The Y chromosome, by contrast, passes exclusively from father to son. Two separate genetic threads, each one recording a different half of the family story. Researchers compared the diversity found in both of these markers across the individuals sequenced at Chagyrskaya. The result was clear. Mitochondrial diversity among the group was far higher than Y chromosome diversity among the men. The logic that follows from that gap is straightforward. If the men's Y chromosomes were all closely related to one another, but the women's mitochondrial lines showed far more variation, that points to one conclusion. The men in this group grew up together, generation after generation, in the same community. The women did not. They arrived from elsewhere, carrying maternal lineages that traced back to different, less closely related source populations. This wasn't a brand new idea in Neanderthal research. The same diversity comparison logic had been applied over a decade earlier, in a 2011 study of the El Sidron site in Spain, examining patrilocal mating behavior in an entirely different Neanderthal population. Two independent studies, two different continents, converging on the same underlying method and reaching a matching conclusion. What set Chagyrskaya apart was the resolution. This marked the first time this dual marker method had been applied with this level of precision to a single specific Neanderthal community, rather than to a broad, generalized population sample spread across sites and centuries. The math behind that female diversity gap turned out to be even more striking once it was actually calculated. That gap between men and women wasn't just a general trend. Researchers put an actual number on it. Using a kinship clock built from the genetic data, they calculated that two male individuals within the Chagyrskaya group shared a common ancestor only around 450 years before their own lifetimes. For the female individuals in the same group, the equivalent figure came out to roughly 4,350 years, nearly 10 times deeper into the past. That difference is the numerical fingerprint of a patrilocal society. Men's lineages stayed rooted in one place, tightly related generation after generation. Women's lineages traced back to source populations that were far more distant and far less connected to the group they eventually joined. The interpretation lines up with everything observed so far. Neanderthal daughters routinely left their birth communities once they reached maturity, moving on to join new groups, while sons remained in place for their entire lives. And this pattern wasn't unique to Chagyrskaya. It matches the earlier prediction drawn from the 2011 El Sidron study in Spain. The same social structure, confirmed independently, separated by thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years. There's a further wrinkle in the genetic overlap. The communities these women migrated into likely weren't total strangers. Genetic overlap between neighboring groups suggests women were moving through networks of already familiar populations, not vanishing into unknown territory. One group they were decidedly not moving into, despite living right next door, was Denisovan. Chagyrskaya sits within roughly 100 kilometers of Denisova Cave, the site that gave its name to an entirely separate archaic human lineage, the Denisovans, first identified there and studied extensively in the decades since. Given that proximity, it would be reasonable to expect some genetic overlap between the two groups. The data said otherwise. Researchers found no evidence of Denisovan gene flow into the Chagyrskaya Neanderthals across the 20,000 years before these particular individuals lived. Nothing. No trace of mixing, despite the two populations sharing a relatively small stretch of Siberian landscape. This absence carries weight because Neanderthal denisovan interbreeding is well documented elsewhere, in this same region and time period. It wasn't that mixing between these two hominin groups was rare or impossible. It clearly happened, just not here, not with this particular Neanderthal community. The natural conclusion is that these two populations, though geographically close, remained socially or temporally separated at Chagyrskaya specifically. Proximity on a map didn't translate into contact on the ground. That absence sharpens the overall picture considerably. Rather than an open, freely mixing landscape where every nearby hominin group interacted with every other, Chagyrskaya looks like a genuinely closed social network, self-contained, insulated from at least one of its closest geographic neighbors. The contrast sets up a discovery from that very same Denisova cave that breaks this pattern completely, in a way nobody at Chagyrskaya could have anticipated. Sediment buried in the cave floor had its own story to tell about who these people were talking to. Skeletal remains weren't the only source of genetic material available to researchers working this site. They also extracted and sequenced DNA directly from the sediment itself. The compacted layers of dirt and debris built up over millennia inside Chagyrskaya cave. Two of those sediment samples produced a surprising result. Genetically, they were closer to individuals recovered from Okladnikov cave than to the actual Chagyrskaya cave mates surrounding them in the same sediment layers. Okladnikov, the nearby site that had already contributed two of the study's 13 usable genomes, turns out to be genetically present inside Chagyrskaya itself, embedded in the ground. This lines up directly with the earlier clue from the stone tools, the matching raw material recovered at both sites. What had been a physical hint of contact between these two communities now has genetic confirmation behind it. These weren't just two geographically close populations existing in parallel. They were in active contact with one another, close enough that genetic material from one site turns up in the sediment of the other. This also represents a methodological milestone. This is one of the first instances of sediment DNA being used to trace movement between two specific, named Neanderthal sites, rather than being applied to a broad, generalized regional population. It adds an entirely new layer of evidence, one the skeletal remains alone could never have revealed. Movement invisible in bone. Visible in dirt. None of this had been possible without a strange inbreeding backstory that started decades earlier. Before Chagyrskaya ever entered the picture, the most detailed family data anyone had recovered from a Neanderthal came from a single woman, her genome sequenced from a toe bone found at Denisova cave. That work, published by Prüfer and colleagues in Nature, volume 505, pages 43 through 49, back in 2014, revealed something startling buried in her own DNA. Her parents were related at the level of half-siblings. It didn't stop with her parents. The genome showed that mating among close relatives ran throughout her recent ancestry, generation after generation. Not an isolated incident, a pattern. Researchers estimated that her lineage had diverged from other Neanderthal populations somewhere between 77,000 and 114,000 years ago, placing her population tens of thousands of years older and considerably more isolated than the group later found at Chagyrskaya. The genetic evidence for this was concrete. Over 20 long runs of homozygosity turned up in her genome, matching exactly the signature expected when parents share the same set of grandparents, as half-siblings do. And broader research from this same era of study estimated Neanderthal band sizes at somewhere between 3 and 30 individuals, small enough that avoiding close relative mating altogether may have been nearly impossible. Chagyrskaya's group showed the same warning sign, just measured a different way. That warning sign came into focus once researchers compared the Chagyrskaya group's overall homozygosity, its genetic evidence of inbreeding, against known populations living today. The result placed them alongside isolated mountain gorilla populations, among the most inbred great ape groups currently alive on the planet. It's a strange thing to sit with, a 54,000-year-old human relative, genetically standing shoulder to shoulder with a modern, deeply isolated primate population. The comparison drives home just how small and closed these Neanderthal communities really were, reinforcing that earlier estimate of 10 to 20 people making up the entire group. Genetic isolation at this level doesn't typically describe a temporary dip in population. It signals long-term demographic strain, the kind that builds up slowly across many generations rather than arriving all at once. A community this inbred, surviving generation after generation, points in two very different directions at once. It could suggest remarkable resilience, a group finding a way to persist despite the odds. Or it could suggest this pattern was already contributing to a decline researchers know, from the historical record, was coming for the species as a whole. Thousands of kilometers west, a completely separate Neanderthal family was showing the exact same signature. That western signature came from El Sidron Cave in Asturias, in northern Spain, where Laluesa Fox and colleagues, publishing in PNAS Volume 108, pages 250 through 253, in 2011, recovered somewhere between 12 and 13 Neanderthal individuals. The composition of that group told its own story: multiple adults, adolescents, juveniles, and a single infant. A genuine multi-generational unit, not a random cluster of unrelated bones. The site dates to roughly 49,000 years ago, separating it from Chagyrskaya by about 5,000 years and the entire width of the European continent. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of this group revealed low genetic diversity and close kinship among its members. This was the original evidence, arriving over a decade before Chagyrskaya's discovery, for patrilocal mating behavior in Neanderthals. It's the reason researchers had a hypothesis worth testing when they eventually turned to the Siberian site. The newer study didn't invent this idea, it confirmed and sharpened an older one. Put plainly, two independent Neanderthal populations, separated by two continents and thousands of years, converged on the exact same female dispersal social pattern. One El Sidron individual's genome went further than any inbreeding signal found anywhere else in the species. That individual carries a lab designation, SD1253. Her genome held a longer cumulative stretch of homozygous DNA than any other sequenced Neanderthal on record. More than Vindija, more than Altai, more than the Denisova cave lineage. That makes SD1253 the single most genetically inbred Neanderthal individual documented anywhere in the fossil record. The genetics didn't stand alone. A 2019 study published in Scientific Reports went back to the bones themselves and cross-checked the genetic prediction against physical evidence. Across the 1,674 skeletal specimens recovered from El Sidron, researchers identified 17 distinct congenital anomalies: narrowing of the nasal fossa, retained deciduous canines, clefting along the vertebrae. These aren't abstract genetic probabilities. They're visible, physical costs, written into bone, of generations of close relative mating. This is one of the rare instances in paleogenetics where a genetic inbreeding prediction and direct skeletal evidence line up cleanly within the same population, each one confirming the other. Researchers studying El Sidron have drawn a direct line from this pattern to broader questions about Neanderthal extinction risk. Small, isolated, inbred groups carry an inherent vulnerability to collapse that larger, more genetically diverse populations don't face in the same way. But not every unexpected relationship uncovered in these caves was between two Neanderthals. That unexpected relationship has a name: Denny. Sloan and colleagues, publishing in Nature, Volume 561, pages 113 through 116, in 2018, described a bone fragment recovered from Denisova Cave, identified only after researchers sorted through roughly 2,000 otherwise unidentifiable fragments using a technique called ZOO-MS collagen fingerprinting. What the genomic analysis, led by Viviane Sloan and Svante Pabo, revealed was almost an even split down the middle. Denny's mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. She stands as the only first-generation hybrid offspring of two distinct hominin lineages ever directly identified from ancient remains anywhere. She died at roughly 13 years old, approximately 90,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before the family later found at Chagyrskaya, a cave sitting just 100 kilometers away, ever lived. The complexity in her genome ran deeper still. Her Denisovan father carried his own trace of Neanderthal ancestry, inherited from an interbreeding event 300 to 600 generations before his own lifetime, mixing layered on top of mixing. Meanwhile, her mother's population turned out to be more closely related to later Neanderthals found in Europe than to an earlier Neanderthal lineage recovered from that very same cave, pointing toward a Neanderthal migration across Eurasia sometime after 120,000 years ago. 4 separate families, 4 separate caves, and one shared pattern started to emerge. That pattern comes into full view once all 4 sites are set side by side. Chagyrskaya, in Siberia, roughly 54,000 years old, a confirmed father and daughter, an extended kin network, a strong signal of female dispersal. The Altai lineage at Denisova Cave, dated between 77,000 and 114,000 years ago. Half-sibling parents, generations of inbreeding written into a single genome. El Sidron, in Spain, roughly 49,000 years old, a multi-generational kin group, the most inbred individual documented anywhere in the species, and skeletal proof of what that inbreeding actually cost. And Denisova 11, known as Denny, at roughly 90,000 years old, direct evidence that the boundaries between hominin groups weren't fixed at all. Mixing happened at the level of individuals, not just entire populations. 4 sites, 2 continents, tens of thousands of years separating them. And underneath all of it, the same underlying architecture keeps surfacing. Tiny bands numbering somewhere between 3 and 30 people. Women consistently moving out to new groups. Men consistently staying put. And close relative mating running as a persistent undercurrent through generation after generation. The El Sidron anomaly study makes the stakes of that pattern explicit, linking it directly to extinction vulnerability across the species as a whole. Not confined to one unlucky, isolated group, but describing a condition that may have touched Neanderthal populations broadly. All of this, every relationship, every migration, every inbreeding signal, was reconstructed from fragments smaller than a fingernail. None of these findings existed before the first Neanderthal draft genome was published in 2010. Measured against that starting point, the entire field of Neanderthal kinship analysis is younger than 15 years old. In that short span, genome-wide data has expanded from a single individual to dozens of genomes recovered across more than 14 archaeological sites scattered throughout Eurasia. The chagyrskaya study alone added 13 new genomes in a single publication, more than half the total number sequenced across the entire prior decade combined. The tools driving this expansion keep getting sharper. ZooMS collagen fingerprinting now allows researchers to identify a single hominin bone fragment from among thousands of otherwise unidentifiable pieces of bone rubble. The exact method that led to Denny's discovery. Sediment DNA extraction, the technique that linked Chagyrskaya to Okladnikov, means entire community connections can now be traced without recovering a single identifiable bone at all. This is a field moving fast enough that the family tree laid out across this entire documentary could look incomplete or outdated within just a few years. And the researchers themselves admit they're nowhere near finished. That admission isn't modesty. Only about a third of Chagyrskaya cave has actually been excavated to date. Less than a quarter of the Neanderthal remains already recovered from the site have even been genetically analyzed yet. Skov has stated plainly what he hopes comes next. That future work could locate the teenage girl's missing mother, completing a fuller Neanderthal family tree than exists for any group studied so far. El Sidron tells a similar story of ongoing revision. That site continues to yield new skeletal analysis decades after its original 1994 discovery. The 2019 anomaly study arrived a full 8 years after the original genetic kinship paper first described the group. The pattern repeats across the whole field. Every prior final word on Neanderthal population history has eventually been overturned by better sequencing technology. First, the 2010 draft genome reset expectations. Then the Altai genome in 2014 added the half-sibling parents. Then Denny in 2018 broke the boundary between species entirely. Then Chagyrskaya in 2022 delivered the first confirmed family. The unexcavated 2/3 of Chagyrskaya alone could plausibly still contain more direct relatives of the family already confirmed. What's already been found is still reshaping how the species end gets explained. Look at the numbers that keep recurring across every single site in this story, and a pattern locks into place. 3 to 30 individuals per band. Over and over, across 4 independent sites, describing a species living at what amounts to a demographic knife's edge. The inbreeding signals weren't confined to one unlucky location. They showed up across 4 geographically distant sites, independently, which suggests this wasn't a local anomaly affecting one struggling group. It looks like a condition affecting the species broadly. The El Sidron skeletal anomaly study states the extinction connection outright, a demographic history built on small, isolated, variably inbred groups, generation after generation. Female-only dispersal, confirmed independently at both El Sidron and Chagyrskaya, may have been the one mechanism working to keep these tiny populations from complete genetic collapse. New mothers, new lineages, new genetic material flowing in from outside. Even that mechanism had its limits. The Altai woman's own parents were half-siblings, despite this same dispersal system apparently operating within her population too. The safety valve didn't always hold. The picture that emerges from 4 sites, 2 continents, and tens of thousands of years isn't a single dramatic extinction event. It's generations of small, connected groups slowly running out of genetic room to maneuver. A father and his daughter, sequenced from the floor of a Siberian cave, turned out to be a window into exactly that slow ending. 2/3 of Chagyrskaya cave remains completely unexcavated, and somewhere in that unexplored ground, the search for the girl's mother continues. Every hominin genome sequenced over the last several years has added something no one predicted going in. Denny, entirely unexpected. The half-sibling parents at Altai, buried in a single toe bone. The congenital anomalies at sidron, confirming in bone what genetics had only implied. The 4 families traced across this documentary didn't just prove that Neanderthals lived in structured kin groups. They proved that researchers can now reconstruct individual, named relationships from 50,000-year-old bone dust and cave dirt. A father, a daughter, an aunt, a cousin, pulled out of sediment and fragments that once looked like nothing more than rubble. What began as a single confirmed father-daughter match has already rewritten the timeline of Neanderthal migration, reshaped understanding of Neanderthal mating behavior, and sharpened the case for the demographic pressure that likely pushed the species toward extinction. The next bone fragment pulled from that unexcavated 2/3 of the cave could be her mother. Or it could be someone else entirely, someone who reshapes this family tree all over again. If a species that vanished 40,000 years ago can still hand researchers a father and his daughter, then the real question is what else is still down there, in the dark, waiting to be found.